The doorbell rang at 11 o'clock at night, and when I opened it, my son said, "We're moving in," while his wife pushed a laminated list of house rules into my hand. My hands went cold. 42 years I'd owned that house, free and clear, raised him under that roof, and she wanted breakfast on the table by 6. I simply smiled and thanked her for the list. She had no idea I already had one of my own. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and I am 68 years old. I have lived in this house on Larkspur Lane for 42 years, since Frank and I bought it for $18,000 with a mortgage we paid off in 19 years, one careful payment at a time. I raised our son Daniel in the bedroom at the end of the hall, the one that still has a faint pencil mark on the door frame from the summer he grew 4 inches in 3 months. I worked 26 years as a school secretary at Lincoln Elementary, filing attendance cards and mixing plaster casts for scraped knees, while Frank drove a delivery route 6 days a week so that Daniel could have piano lessons and a decent bicycle, and, later, a college education neither of us had. When Daniel turned 18, I emptied the savings account I had built dollar by dollar since his birth and paid $52,000 toward 4 years of tuition at a state university because I did not want him to start his adult life the way Frank and I had started ours, buried under debt before we'd even begun to live. When he married Vanessa 10 years ago, I wrote a check for $40,000 without blinking because that is what mothers do. Or so I believed at the time. I did not think of it as a transaction. I thought of it as love with a number attached. I want you to understand the texture of those years because it matters for what comes later. Frank and I were not wealthy people. We were careful people, which is a different thing entirely. And there is a particular pride in careful money that wealthy people rarely understand. I clipped coupons every Sunday from the newspaper at this same kitchen table, sorted into a plastic accordion folder by aisle so that grocery trips took 20 minutes instead of 45. I sewed the hem on Daniel's Sunday trousers 3 separate times rather than buy a new pair, not because we couldn't afford new trousers, but because Frank and I had made a private agreement, never spoken aloud but perfectly understood between us, that every dollar not spent on ourselves was a dollar that could become Daniel's future instead. When the school district offered summer curriculum training that paid an extra $1,100, I took it every single year for 19 years, giving up 6 weeks of my own rest each summer, and I put every one of those checks into an envelope in the back of my sock drawer labeled, in my own handwriting, Daniel, someday. By the time he graduated high school, that envelope alone held nearly $21,000, money that later became part of the $52,000 I gave him for college. These were not gestures. They were years. And I want to be honest, I never once resented giving them. What I came to resent, much later, was the assumption that grew out of them, the quiet belief, never stated but always present, that a mother who gives without condition can therefore be taken from without consequence. Frank died 9 years ago, in March, of a heart that simply stopped one Tuesday afternoon while he was raking leaves. He insisted on raking himself, despite my nagging. I was 59 years old, and I had never lived alone in my life, not for a single night, and I discovered in the months that followed that grief has a particular silence to it, a silence that fills a house the way water fills a glass, right up to the very rim. Daniel came around more in those first 2 years. He mowed my lawn. He fixed the gutter. He called on Sundays. I thought, foolishly, that this was simply who he was now, a grown man taking care of his widowed mother, and I let myself lean into that belief the way you lean into a chair you have not tested, trusting it will hold your weight. It was around 4 years ago that I began noticing the small things. Vanessa stopped saying thank you when I gave her Christmas cards with cash folded inside, cards I had once watched her open with genuine delight. She started referring to my house, in conversations I was not meant to overhear, as the property, a word so cold and clinical that it made the back of my neck prickle the first time I heard it through the kitchen wall while I was watering my African violets on the windowsill. Daniel began asking questions that sounded casual but were not. How much was the house worth now? Had I ever considered a reverse mortgage? Wouldn't it be smarter for tax purposes if the deed had more than one name on it? I answered honestly each time, the way you answer a child who asks where babies come from, giving him only as much truth as I judged the moment could hold, and each time I felt something in my chest tighten one notch further, like a belt being cinched by a hand I could not see. There were other small things, the kind of things that mean nothing on their own and everything once you line them up in a row. Vanessa began arriving at my house on weekday afternoons without calling first, and I would come downstairs to find her measuring the width of my hallway with a fabric tape measure, explaining, when I asked, that she was just curious how a stair lift might fit, though I had never once complained of trouble with the stairs and, at 64, took them 2 at a time most mornings. My address began appearing, without my knowledge or permission, on marketing mail from 2 different assisted living facilities across town, glossy brochures addressed directly to me with my name spelled correctly, which told me someone had submitted a request on my behalf, because I had certainly never called either place. When I mentioned this to Daniel, mildly, over coffee, he laughed it off as a mailing list error, and I let him believe I accepted that explanation, filing the brochures instead in a folder in my closet rather than the recycling bin, a decision that would later matter more than I could have guessed. At Thanksgiving that year, Vanessa's cousin, a woman I had met perhaps twice, asked me at the table, in front of 11 people, whether I had started thinking about long-term care planning yet, in the particular gentle but probing tone people use when they already know the answer they're fishing for. I said I hadn't, and I smiled, and I passed the cranberry sauce, and underneath the tablecloth my hand was gripping my napkin hard enough to leave creases that took 2 washes to fully release. I began, without fully admitting it to myself, keeping a kind of mental ledger of these moments, the way I used to keep a ledger of school supply requisitions, small entries that meant little alone but accumulated into something undeniable over time. The tape measure in the hallway, the brochures in the mail, the cousin's question at Thanksgiving. A comment Vanessa made at Christmas, laughing, about how Grandma's house has such good bones, it'd be a shame to ever sell it to strangers. A sentence that on its surface sounded like affection and underneath sounded like an appraisal. An afternoon in February when I mentioned, offhand, that I was thinking of finally replacing the roof, and watched Daniel's face do something complicated and quick. A flicker of calculation he clearly did not intend for me to see before he said, too quickly, that he'd help me look into financing it. I did not need help financing a roof. I had the money sitting in savings, as he well knew, having grown up watching his father and me never once borrow for a repair we could pay for outright. What he was really offering, I understood only later, was a foothold. A loan he could help arrange, paperwork he could help me sign, a door left slightly ajar that could, over time, be widened. 3 years ago, Daniel lost his job at the logistics company where he had worked for nearly a decade, and within 2 months, he stopped making payments on the $18,000 car loan I had co-signed for him 5 years earlier, a car I had co-signed because his credit was thin and mine was not. I did not want to see his credit destroyed, so I took over the payments myself, $500 a month for 36 months, $18,000 total, money I paid quietly from my own retirement savings without ever once mentioning it at Thanksgiving dinner. 2 years ago, when he and Vanessa wanted to buy their first house, I gave them $60,000 as what we agreed, in writing, on a single handwritten page we both signed, would be a loan, to be repaid at their convenience, no interest, no pressure. That page is still in my fireproof box in the hall closet, exactly where I put it. Not $1 of that $60,000 has ever come back to me. Not one. I want to be honest with you, the way I would be honest with a friend across my kitchen table, because that is what you are to me now. I did not, at first, notice the pattern as a pattern. I noticed it the way you notice a single loose thread on a sweater, something to snip later, not something that tells you the whole seam is coming undone. It was only in looking backward, once I understood what was coming, that I saw the thread had been pulling the entire time, and the sweater had been unraveling since the day Frank died, and I became, in the eyes of my son and his wife, not a mother, but a resource. The moment the pattern became undeniable was this past spring, on a Sunday afternoon in April. I had gone out to the garden to cut back the roses, and the kitchen window was open above me, and I heard Vanessa's voice drifting down, low and matter-of-fact, the way people speak when they believe no one is listening. "She's not going to live forever," she said to Daniel. "And when she goes, or when she can't manage on her own anymore, this house needs to already be set up the right way." My aunt didn't do the paperwork in time with my grandmother, and the state took half of everything in fees. Daniel's response was quieter, and I could not make out every word, but I heard the shape of it, a kind of tired agreement, the sound of a man who has stopped fighting a current and simply lets it carry him. I stood there with pruning shears in my gloved hand and a rose thorn pressed into my palm hard enough to leave a mark, and I understood, all at once and completely, that my son's wife was not planning for my death. She was planning for my incapacity. Those are very different things, and only one of them requires me to still be breathing and still be considered unable to speak for myself. I did not confront them that day. Confrontation would have given them the chance to smooth it over, to call it a misunderstanding, to make me feel foolish for having listened at my own window in my own garden. Instead, I went inside, washed my hands, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at my kitchen table for a long time, watching the steam rise and disappear. I thought about Frank, about the way he used to say that the quietest people in a room are usually the ones doing the most thinking. I thought about the fact that I had spent 40 years being underestimated. By the men at the bank who spoke slowly to me when I applied for our mortgage, by the school district that passed me over for a promotion I was better qualified for than the man who got it, by my own son, apparently, who had somehow come to believe that his mother, a woman who had balanced a household budget to the penny for 4 decades, could be maneuvered out of her own home without noticing. I decided, sitting there with my tea going cold, that I was done being underestimated. Not with anger, with clarity. There is a difference, and it is the difference that matters. I thought, too, about my own mother, who had lived her final 11 years in a facility she never chose, moved there by a brother-in-law who had power of attorney and, as it turned out, considerably less patience than integrity. I remembered visiting her on Sunday afternoons, watching her look out a window at a parking lot instead of the garden she had tended for 40 years. And I remembered promising myself, in the particular silent way you make promises to the dead, that I would never let that happen to me without a fight. I had thought, for years, that keeping that promise simply meant staying healthy, staying sharp, staying independent as long as biology allowed. Sitting at my kitchen table that afternoon, I understood for the first time that it also meant something more active than that. It meant refusing to be managed by people who loved the idea of caring for me more than they loved the actual, inconvenient, opinionated woman I still was. When had I become someone people discussed instead of someone people asked? I could not pinpoint the exact day, and that frightened me more than anything Vanessa had said through that window. But I could pinpoint the day I decided to stop it, and that day was this one. The first person I called was Ruth Alvarez, who has lived 2 doors down from me for 31 years, and who spent the last 15 years of her career as a paralegal specializing in elder law before she retired. Ruth is 71, sharp as a tack, and has never once in 3 decades minced words with me. I walked over the next morning with a plate of banana bread as an excuse and told her everything. The overheard conversation, the unpaid loans, the growing list of small, unsettling comments. Ruth set down her coffee cup very deliberately and said, "Eleanor, I want you to listen to me carefully. What you just described to me is not a family being close. It is a family positioning itself. And you need to move faster than they are moving. Because right now, you are the only one in this story who doesn't know the ending." She was right, and I knew she was right, and something in me that had been braced and frightened since that afternoon in the garden finally exhaled. Ruth gave me the name of an elder law attorney she trusted completely, a man named Harold Bennett, who had an office downtown above the old hardware store and who, Ruth told me, does not let anyone push a client into anything, including you. Ruth and I sat on her back porch that afternoon for nearly 2 hours, the banana bread going untouched between us, and she told me things I had never known about her own career, cases she had worked in her 20s and 30s, families that looked loving on the surface and were quietly hollowing themselves out underneath, the way termites can leave a beam looking whole for years before it finally gives way under weight. "The families that scare me most," she said, "were never the ones that screamed. They were the ones that smiled and brought casseroles and called every Sunday, right up until the day the paperwork was ready." She poured us both more coffee before continuing, unhurried, the way she has always approached anything worth saying properly. "I watched a woman lose her house of 40 years to her own grandson," Ruth said. "Not because he was a monster, but because she waited too long to believe he could become one. By the time she called me, the paperwork was already filed. I couldn't undo it. I've never forgotten that feeling, Eleanor, the feeling of being 1 week too late." She reached across and squeezed my hand, and her grip was stronger than I expected from a woman her age. "You are not paranoid," Eleanor, you are paying attention. There's a difference, and most women your age have had that difference trained out of them by people who benefit from them staying quiet. I told her I was frightened, not of Daniel exactly, but of what he was allowing himself to become, and Ruth nodded slowly and said something I have carried with me every day since. Fear is fine. Fear can sit in the passenger seat. Just don't let it drive. I have thought of that sentence more times than I can count in the months since. I met with Harold Bennett the following Tuesday. He was a compact, silver-haired man in his 60s with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose and a manner so calm it was almost contagious. I told him everything, start to finish, and when I finished, he did not look surprised, only thoughtful, the way a doctor looks when a patient describes symptoms he has heard 100 times before. This is more common than you'd think, he told me. And the good news, Mrs. Whitfield, is that you came to me while you are still entirely, unquestionably capable of making your own decisions. That timing is everything. We are going to build something that cannot be argued with later. He explained that the first step was documentation of my own competency, a formal evaluation from my physician, dated and on file, so that no one could ever credibly claim, months or years from now, that I had not been of sound mind when I made the decisions that were about to follow. The second step was moving the house itself out of my individual name and into an irrevocable trust, with myself as sole trustee during my lifetime, which would mean that no court proceeding regarding my capacity, now or in the future, could touch the property, because legally, I would no longer be the one who owned it in the way a court could reach. The house would belong to the trust, and I would control the trust entirely for as long as I was able, with instructions Harold and I would write together for exactly what would happen if I ever were not. I want to tell you something about that appointment, something I have not told anyone else, not even Ruth. When Harold Bennett slid the engagement letter across his desk for me to sign, my hand shook, just slightly, not from fear, but from the strange, heavy feeling of formally arming myself against my own child. I signed it anyway. Frank used to say that love without boundaries isn't love. It's just erosion, and I had let myself be eroded for 4 years without fully admitting it. That signature was the first stone I placed to stop the water. Over the following 6 weeks, I moved with the kind of quiet, unhurried precision I used to bring to closing out the school's books at the end of each fiscal year, every column checked twice before I signed off on it. Harold drafted the trust documents, and I had my physician, Dr. Patel, who has treated me for 11 years, complete a full cognitive evaluation, which came back exactly as I expected. Sharp, unremarkable, entirely competent, dated and notarized, and placed in Harold's file alongside a letter from Dr. Patel stating in plain language that I showed no signs whatsoever of cognitive decline. I opened a new bank account at a credit union across town, one Daniel and Vanessa did not know existed, and I began, gradually, moving a portion of my savings there, not out of my other accounts entirely, which would have raised questions, but enough that if anyone ever tried to freeze or access the accounts they knew about, they would find considerably less than they expected. I did this in small increments, never more than a few $1,000s at a time, transferred on different days of the week, the way Harold advised, so that nothing about the pattern would draw attention, even if someone were watching my statements closely, which I had no reason to believe they were, but Harold's philosophy, and one I came to adopt fully as my own, was that a good plan assumes the worst case. Observer and proceeds accordingly. I also quietly canceled the joint access Daniel had once had, years earlier, to a small utility account I had set up for him during a rough patch after college. Access I had simply forgotten to revoke once he no longer needed it. The kind of loose thread that Harold pointed out within minutes of reviewing my account list, and that I was faintly embarrassed not to have noticed myself. "This is normal," he told me, when he saw my face fall at the oversight. "Most of my clients have 3 or 4 of these lying around. Trust isn't a mistake, Mrs. Whitfield. Failing to revisit it periodically is simply an oversight, and you're correcting it now, which is what matters." The second stage of the plan concerned the house itself, and this was the part that required the most patience, because Daniel and Vanessa had, by then, already moved their 2 suitcases into my guest room, and Vanessa's laminated list of rules was still taped to my refrigerator door. Breakfast at 6, bathrooms nightly, shirts pressed, dresses hung, and never folded. I followed her rules. Every single one, For weeks, with a pleasant, agreeable expression that I had perfected over 40 years of dealing with difficult parents at Lincoln Elementary who believed their child could do no wrong, I pressed shirts. I hung dresses. I set the table at 6 each morning with the eggs done the way Vanessa liked them, and while I did it, I watched and I listened, and I let them believe I was exactly the compliant, aging woman they had decided I was. There is a particular discipline required to smile at someone while you are quietly building the case that will end their access to you, and I will admit it did not come naturally at first. The mornings were the hardest. Vanessa liked her eggs a particular way, whites fully set, yolks still loose, and she would tap 2 fingers on the counter if I got it wrong, a small, habitual gesture she likely did not even notice herself making anymore. I got it wrong exactly twice, early on, out of nerves rather than carelessness, and both times she said nothing aloud but wrote a small note on her list, updating the instructions as though correcting an employee. I kept that updated list. I photographed it with my phone the second week, dated the photo, and sent it to myself in an email with the subject line, "For Harold," because even a laminated list of household rules I had come to understand was itself a kind of evidence, a record, in her own handwriting, of exactly how she believed my house and my labor belonged to her. What Vanessa did not know, because I never told her, was that Harold and I had drawn up a simple, legally binding residential agreement, the kind any landlord uses, stating that Daniel and Vanessa were occupying a room in my home as tenants at will, with no lease term, which meant that under the laws of our state, I could terminate their residency with 30 days written notice, for any reason or no reason at all. I asked them to sign it under the guise of insurance requirements, explaining, with a straight face, I am rather proud of to this day, that my homeowner's policy required documentation of any adult residence for liability purposes. Daniel signed without reading it closely, the way he has signed most documents in his adult life, trusting that the world would not do to him what he was, at that very moment, quietly attempting to do to me. Vanessa read it more carefully. I could tell by the slight pause before her signature, but she signed too, because to refuse would have meant explaining why she objected to a simple insurance form, and she was not yet ready to show her hand. The third stage was the gathering of proof, and this was the part I found, to my own surprise, almost peaceful to do. I am a woman who has always kept records. Every receipt, every bank statement, every canceled check going back decades, because that is how Frank and I were raised, in households where nothing was thrown away that might someday be needed. I pulled together the original handwritten loan agreement for the $60,000, still unpaid. I pulled together 3 years of bank statements showing the $18,000 in car payments I had made after Daniel stopped. I printed the wire transfer records from the wedding gift, $40,000, and the tuition payments, $52,000 across 4 years, each one time-stamped and dated, a complete and irrefutable ledger of a lifetime of love that had been quietly, systematically taken for granted. There had been a smaller version of this moment a few weeks earlier, one I had almost let pass without weight. I had been kneeling in the front garden, hidden from view by the hydrangea bushes Frank planted the year Daniel was born, when I heard Daniel on the porch above me, on the phone with someone from his old job, complaining in a low voice about money, about how living with my mom was supposed to be temporary, just until we got back on our feet. But Vanessa's talking like it's permanent now, like the whole point was always the house. I remember staying very still among the hydrangeas, a bee circling near my ear, and thinking, with a kind of cold clarity, that I had just heard my son describe my home not as a refuge he was grateful for, but as an objective his wife was working toward. I did not mention it to him. I wrote it down instead. That same evening, in the small spiral notebook I had started keeping in my nightstand drawer, dated, timed, as close to word for word as memory allowed. It was on a Thursday evening in June, while I was folding laundry in the hallway just outside the guest room, that I heard the conversation that changed everything, the conversation Harold would later call, with a small, dry smile, the gift that confirms the whole case. Vanessa was on the phone, and her voice carried the particular carelessness of someone who has stopped bothering to lower it. The real estate agent said the market's insane right now, she was saying. If we can get power of attorney set up before she has any kind of episode. And honestly, at her age, it's only a matter of time. We could list it within the year. Daniel's already the only child. There's no one else to fight us on it. There was a pause, and then, in a tone so light it made my stomach turn, She added, "She's sweet, but let's be real. She's not going to notice anything until it's already done." I stood in that hallway with a warm towel still in my hands, and I did not move for a long moment. There is a particular kind of silence that comes over you when you hear, spoken aloud and without disguise, exactly what you already suspected but had not yet let yourself fully believe. It is not the silence of shock. It is the silence of confirmation, and it is, in its own strange way, almost a relief, because the not knowing had been so much heavier than the knowing turned out to be. If you're still with me, I want you to stay a little longer, because what came next is the part I think about most. If this story is finding you the way I hope it does, be here for what comes next. Subscribe so you don't miss where this goes, and if you're feeling it already, go ahead and tap that like. Now, let me tell you what I did with what I just heard, standing in that hallway with a warm towel still folded over my arm. I did not confront Vanessa that night, either. I went back to folding towels, my hands steady, my face arranged into the same mild, tired expression I had worn for weeks. And the next morning I made breakfast at 6 exactly as her list required, eggs soft, toast cut on the diagonal the way she preferred. But that Friday, I called Harold Bennett and told him what I had heard, word for word, as precisely as I could reconstruct it, and he asked me, gently, whether I would be willing to write it down immediately, dated and signed, as a contemporaneous record, which our state's courts, he explained, treat far more seriously than a memory recalled months later. I did. I wrote it out at my kitchen table that same afternoon, every word I could remember, and Ruth, who happened to be visiting, signed it as a witness that I had shown it to her the day I wrote it. Harold and I finalized the trust the following week. The deed to the house on Larkspur Lane was recorded in the name of the Eleanor Frances Whitfield Revocable Living Trust, with myself as sole trustee and sole beneficiary during my lifetime, and a successor trustee named, not Daniel, but Ruth, along with explicit written instructions that no sale, transfer, or encumbrance of the property could occur without a formal capacity evaluation performed by 2 independent physicians, filed with the county, a bar so high that no quiet power of attorney obtained on a bad afternoon could ever clear it. I also, at Harold's suggestion, executed a new durable power of attorney for finances and a healthcare directive, both naming Ruth rather than Daniel, both notarized, both dated more than a year before any of this began to unfold, so that the timeline itself would tell the story of a woman who had been careful, not reactive. I remember the appointment with Dr. Patel more clearly than almost anything else from that summer, in part because of how ordinary it felt, which was exactly the point. She has been my doctor since before Frank's first heart scare, and she raised an eyebrow when I explained why I wanted a full cognitive evaluation on record, though she did not ask for details beyond what I offered. "You want documentation while there's nothing to document," she said, and I told her yes. That was precisely it. And she smiled in the particular way doctors smile when a patient shows up already understanding the value of prevention. The evaluation took 40 minutes. Memory recall, pattern sequencing, basic arithmetic done aloud, and at the end she typed a short summary while I waited, then turned the screen toward me so I could read it myself before she filed it. Patient demonstrates full orientation to person, place, time, and situation, it read. No evidence of cognitive impairment. Patient articulate, organized, and fully capable of managing personal and financial affairs independently. I asked her to print 2 copies, one for my file and one for Harold's, and she did, without a single question about why a perfectly healthy 68-year-old woman wanted a notarized copy of her own mental clarity sitting in a lawyer's filing cabinet. The final piece was the 30-day notice. I had Harold prepare it formally, citing the residential agreement Daniel and Vanessa had signed under the guise of insurance paperwork, and I asked him one question before I let him finalize it. "Am I a cruel woman for doing this?" Harold took his glasses off, cleaned them slowly on his sleeve, and said, "Mrs. Whitfield, you are not evicting your son. You are declining to be erased inside your own home." There is a considerable difference, and any judge in this state would see it in about 4 minutes. I have held on to that sentence the way you hold onto a smooth stone in your pocket, turning it over when you need to remember why you did what you did. I chose a Sunday for the reveal, because Sundays had always been our family day, back when family still meant what I thought it meant. and there was something almost ceremonial in reclaiming that day for the truth instead of the performance we had all been living inside. I made a roast, the way I always had for Sunday dinner, and I set the table with the good china, the pattern with the small blue cornflowers that had been my mother's. And when Daniel and Vanessa sat down, they had no idea that the folder resting beside my placemat was not, as Vanessa likely assumed, a recipe or a coupon clipping, but a complete and organized record of everything I am about to tell. "You," I said to them that evening. "I know about the power of attorney," I said, once the plates were served and before anyone had lifted a fork, my voice as calm and even as it had been every morning I'd made their breakfast at 6. Vanessa's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Daniel looked at me, confused. The way he used to look at me as a boy when he'd been caught in a lie, he hadn't yet realized was fully unraveled. "I heard you on the phone in June," I continued. "The real estate agent. The comment about how it's only a matter of time before I have an episode. The comment about how I wouldn't notice anything until it was already done." The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and full, the kind of silence I imagine a courtroom has just before a verdict is read. "You were wrong about that last part," I said. "I noticed everything." I opened the folder then, and I laid it out for them the way I used to lay out a school budget for the superintendent, item by item, unhurried, unemotional, entirely factual. $52,000 in tuition. $40,000 for the wedding. $18,000 in car payments I made quietly for 3 years after Daniel stopped paying. $60,000, still owed, still documented in his own handwriting and signature for the down payment on the house they now lived in. "That is $170,000, I said, given freely, gladly, because I loved you both, and because I believed, foolishly, that love was being returned in kind. I let that number sit in the air for a moment, the way Harold had coached me to, because numbers, he said, land harder in silence than in a rush of speech. Vanessa opened her mouth to interrupt, and I raised one hand, gently, the same gesture I had used for 26 years to quiet a room full of restless second graders, and to my mild astonishment, it still worked. "I am not asking for any of it back tonight," I continued. "I am telling you that I know exactly what has been taken from me in every sense of that word, and I want you to understand that the house you have been planning to inherit early is no longer mine to lose control of. It belongs to a trust. It has a trustee who is not you and never will be. And as of this evening, you are both, under the agreement you signed yourselves, receiving 30 days written notice to vacate." I reached into the folder and slid 2 more documents across the table. Copies of the residential agreement bearing both their signatures and a formal letter on Harold Bennett's letterhead confirming the trust's existence and its terms. "I want to be very clear about something," I said, looking at Vanessa directly now, because I wanted her to understand that this part was not for Daniel. This is not a punishment for wanting a future. Every young couple wants a future. This is a consequence for deciding my incapacity was a timeline you could plan around instead of a possibility you'd hope never came. Vanessa's jaw tightened, and for the first time all evening, I saw something flicker across her face that might, in a different woman, have been the beginning of shame. It did not stay long. Daniel's face went through something I will remember for the rest of my life, a kind of collapse that started in his eyes and moved down through his whole body, as though he were watching, in real time, the version of himself he had been quietly becoming for 4 years, suddenly reflected back at him in his mother's steady voice. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. "I didn't. I never said any of that. That was Vanessa. I never agreed to any of it." Vanessa's face, by contrast, hardened immediately, the softness she had always worn like a costume dropping away entirely. "You didn't stop me either," she snapped at him, before turning to me with something close to contempt. "You're being dramatic, Eleanor. Every family thinks about the future. That's not a crime." "No," I agreed, "it isn't. But planning around my incapacity while I am standing in my own kitchen, fully capable, and telling your husband I'll be too far gone to notice, that is not planning, Vanessa. That is theft with better timing." Daniel put his head in his hands, and when he lifted it again, his eyes were wet, and he said something I did not expect, something that told me, more than any apology could have, that there might still be something worth salvaging between us. "I let it happen," he said quietly. "I didn't do the things she was talking about, But I let her talk about them at our kitchen table, and I never once told her to stop. That's on me. That's mine. Vanessa stood up so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor. Unbelievable, she said. So this is what, 20 years of me being the villain and him being the poor, confused son who just went along with it? I'm not staying for this. She left the table, and a few minutes later, I heard the guest room door slam, and then, within the hour, the sound of suitcases being dragged down the hallway toward the front door. Daniel stayed at that table a long time after she left, and we talked, really talked, in a way we had not in years. He told me, haltingly, that he had lost himself somewhere in the last few years, that unemployment and dependence had made him smaller in ways he was ashamed of, and that it had been easier to let Vanessa make the decisions, even decisions about his own mother, than to face how far he had drifted from the man Frank and I had raised him to be. I did not forgive him fully that night. Forgiveness, I have learned, is not a switch you flip. It is a road you walk, and we were only standing at the very beginning of it. But I told him the truth, which was that I loved him still, entirely, and that love and boundaries were not opposites. They were partners, and that he was welcome to find his way back to being a son I could trust, on a timeline that would be earned rather than assumed. Before she left, Vanessa turned in the doorway and delivered one final line, the kind of line I suspect she had been rehearsing without realizing it for months. "You'll regret this when you're old and alone and there's no one left to check on you," she said. I did not raise my voice. I simply said, "Vanessa, I have been checking on myself since before you were born. I will manage." She did not have a response to that, which I confess gave me a small, private satisfaction I am not entirely ashamed of. Daniel, by contrast, did not defend her. That distinction mattered more to me than almost anything else that night. He sat in his chair long after the front door slammed, his shoulders curved forward, and when he finally spoke again, it was not to argue but to ask a single question, quietly, almost like a child. "Do you still love me?" I told him the truth, which was that I had never once stopped, not for a single day, not even in the hallway with the towel in my hands, not even hearing his silence on that porch call among the hydrangeas. He asked, too, in a smaller voice, whether I had already decided, before that dinner, that there was no version of this where Vanessa stayed married to him and remained welcome in my life. I told him honestly that I had not decided that at all, that the decision had never been mine to make, because Vanessa had made it herself the moment she chose a real estate agent over a conversation with me. That distinction seemed to land on him with some weight, and he sat with it a long moment before nodding, slowly, the way a man nods when he is finally hearing something he has needed to hear for a long time, but has not had the courage to say aloud to himself. Loving him and protecting myself from the current he had let himself be pulled into, I explained, were not contradictions. They were both simply true. At the same time, the way grief and gratitude had both been true in the years after Frank died. Vanessa left the house that same night and did not return. Daniel stayed one more week in a small extended stay motel across town, and then, quietly, without fanfare, moved into an apartment of his own, the first place he had ever lived entirely independent of either Vanessa or me. It has now been 6 months. He calls every Sunday, the way he used to, but the calls are different now, less performance, more presence. He has begun, on his own initiative, paying me back $50 a week toward the $60,000 he still owes, and Harold tells me that at that rate it will take him roughly 23 years, which made both of us laugh for the first time in a very long while, a real laugh, the kind that surprises you with how much you needed it. I told Harold that the money was never really the point. The point was whether my son would ever again choose to see me clearly, as a person and not a property line. Slowly, I believe he is learning how. 2 months ago, Daniel showed up on a Saturday morning, unannounced, but this time he came with a coffee for me instead of a suitcase, and he spent the entire afternoon in my garden, cutting back the same roses I had been pruning the day I first overheard Vanessa's voice through the kitchen window. He did not mention the house. He did not mention money. He simply worked beside me in the dirt for 4 hours, the way he used to as a boy, handing me tools before I asked for them, and when he left, he hugged me at the door for longer than he had in years, long enough that I felt, for the first time since the reveal, that some genuine thread between us was being rewoven rather than merely apologized for. Ruth watched him drive away from her porch and later told me, in her characteristically dry way, that's a man doing the actual work instead of talking about doing the work. Don't let him off the hook, but don't ignore the difference either. I have tried to hold both of those instructions at once ever since. Vanessa, I am told through the thin channels of a small town, has moved in with her cousin 2 counties over and tells anyone who will listen that I am a vindictive old woman who turned her own son against his wife over a house. I let people believe what they need to believe. I stopped needing to be understood by everyone the day I stood in that hallway with a warm towel in my hands and finally understood myself. I still live in the house on Larkspur Lane. I still water my African violets on the kitchen windowsill, and some mornings, when the light comes in a certain way across the good china cabinet, I think of Frank raking those leaves in the yard I can see from my window, and I think about how he used to say that the quietest people in a room are usually doing the most thinking. I think he would be proud of how much thinking I finally let myself act on. I am not a bitter woman. I want to be clear about that, because bitterness was never the goal, and it never will be. I simply decided, somewhere between a garden and a folded towel and a Sunday dinner with the good china, that being underestimated was not a life sentence, and that a woman who has spent 40 years balancing budgets, raising children, and burying a husband still has, in her, every capacity required to protect what is hers, calmly, completely, and on her own terms. Ruth and I still sit on her back porch most Sunday evenings now, the way we did the afternoon this all began, and sometimes we don't talk about any of it at all. We talk about her grandchildren, or the tomatoes struggling in my garden bed this year, or whichever mystery novel she's currently 3 chapters into. But every so often, usually unprompted, she'll look over at me with that same steady, assessing gaze she had the day I brought her banana bread and a secret, and she'll say something like, "You know, most women would have just let it happen." I always tell her the same thing in return, because it has become, over these months, the truest sentence I know. I did not save my house because I stopped loving my son. I saved it because I finally understood that love, real love, the kind Frank and I spent 35 years building, does not require a woman to disappear in order to prove it. It asks to be protected as fiercely as it protects. I spent most of my life believing my strength lived in what I was willing to give away. I have learned, in the last 6 months, that it lives just as much in what I am finally willing to keep. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And from where in the world are you listening? Don't forget to like and subscribe, please. There is so much more waiting for you. With love and respect. Until next time.